Jason Seawright is our speaker today, and he's excited about doing this class. And one of the important things that we do in Arlington and Alexandria is we help support the Natural Resources Master Plan for Arlington County and the city of Alexandria. The Arlington County is undergoing a review of the Natural Resources Master Plan and is inviting public input for that plan. So if you live in Arlington and have a stake in this, please join the, get into the program, read the Forestry Natural Resources Master Plan, and make sure that you are getting your voice heard. If you have a concern, particularly about deer or other wildlife issues, urban forestry issues, or anything like that, please let them know what your thoughts are. Okay, I also would like to tell you that in Arlington, we have another wildlife sort of issue. Spotted lanternfly is encroaching upon us, approaching us from the north, from the east, and from the west. And we are asking residents to report sightings of possible spotted lanternfly. And if you go to either the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website or the Extension website, you can find a link to report spotted lanternfly in Arlington and Alexandria. There are other reporting tools that can be used in other counties and other jurisdictions, but if you are in Arlington and Alexandria and think that you've seen a spotted lanternfly, and there's many, many resources on the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website that can help you learn how to identify a spotted lanternfly. Okay, welcome to everybody again, and I'm going to turn it over to Jason Seawright, who's going to be your speaker today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for the kind intro. As Kirsten mentioned, I have kind of been at war with some of the pests that you see listed on your screen today. We're going to kind of talk about these vertebrate pests, what they mean for us, and you know, what it means to have them in your garden and living in your yards and in your area. I think it's important to say just right out front that when we're talking about managing vertebrate pests, they mean something to your community members, to your neighbors, to the environment. So when we talk about managing pests, we are looking for ways to deal with them that are the least damaging, the least invasive when appropriate. We want to have the smallest amount of impact on the natural environment as we can. Have a kind of a multi-step process here. You know, the best management practice for wildlife control, these steps are kind of your key to solving this pest issue. They're really principles of how to think about the problem, almost a methodology, if you will. They're not complex steps, but you'll find that as you're, you know, in the heat of frustration outside, you know, looking at yet another, you know, plant in your garden, be it a vegetable or otherwise, is now missing its head or is significantly damaged from an unknown pest. You know, maybe you're not thinking clearly. You're a little frustrated, and you know, you're declaring that it's the rabbits or the deer again. But when in reality, you kind of need to take a systematic approach to examine the problem and identify, you know, the culprit. You also need to understand the laws of your community. What are the rules in your local area? What are the rules in your state? What are you allowed to do, and what resources are available to you? And then, you know, just the pest and its habits, its life cycles, and what are its predators. So step one is identify species before you choose a control. And a control is, you know, how you're going to deal with that species that's a problem for you. A positive identification is 100% required. You know, you're not going to be successful most of the time if you're guessing, right? So one really great example of, you know, positive identity is between moles and voles. Most people, the uninitiated, I guess, wouldn't really know the difference based on the damage. If you can see from the pictures, there's some mounds of dirt on the right side where there's molehills, where they burrow up and then they create these mounds, and then they pop their little heads up like in the picture, and then they go back underground. And then on the left, you have vole tracks, which are tunnels that are kind of at soil level. And they remain above ground, and they create these, you know, these highway tracks. And if you think it's a mole and you're actually dealing with a vole problem, that's going to be a very different way to control that problem, because in this particular case, moles are carnivores and voles are herbivores. So, you might identify that you have a grub problem in your lawn, or you might know that you have, for example, a grub problem, which moles tend to gravitate towards grubs because they're carnivores. But if you have vole tracks, then you're treating a problem that you don't have. So identifying the species before you choose a control is absolutely it's the most important step number one. Number two, understand what's in your local surroundings, right? We have some tight yards in urban environments. We share fences. Sometimes we don't have fences. We have just open yards. So you may not have control of everything outside your property, but identifying, standing water or food, access to food or shelter, be it a pile of wood or a particularly thick brush pile, along maybe a forest edge or like a property line that's, maybe neglected behind a shed, something that could harbor pests or attract pests. Identifying those areas and removing them is another like core principle step, because if you remove the areas that these pests feel safe in, then they're less likely to be around your local area. Step three is really combining tactics for the best control strategy. So this is less of a step and more of a concept. For each pest, there's multiple different strategies that you can employ to successfully, control that problem. They vary and range from not planting a particular plant, or putting a fence around your plants, using a pesticide, or depending on what the problem is, maybe identifying where the pest is living, like in the case of the house sparrow. Where are their nests, and when do they lay eggs, understanding seasonally whenever their breeding patterns are, so that you could identify eggs and stop the problem from spreading further. Or just identifying that this particular pest, in this case the house sparrow, likes to roost. It looks for, branches and high places where it can kind of loom over whatever food it's eyeing up in your garden. And if you can remove that roost site or disrupt that roost site, then that may be an effective control. But in the end, usually for most problems, there's not going to be one single control that solves the entire problem. It's going to be a combination, really, that's going to come together and create a single strategy to try and manage the pest that you're dealing with. Step four is encouraging the success of natural predators. Let nature do the work for you. It's the circle of life. There are predators in your backyard, just like there are pests in your backyard, and sometimes they're the same thing. But creating an environment where predators can do their jobs effectively, especially in the presence of a pest that is particularly vulnerable to predators. Go back to the moles and voles comment. You may not necessarily understand or feel the impact of creating a better environment for predators, but I can guarantee you, if you help to encourage the success of natural predators, it will have an impact on your problem. Specifically, decluttering your landscape, maybe trimming your grass a little lower than normal, or clearing out that brush pile, or trimming up trees, just creating sight lines that work for predators, and that'll increase their access, in the end, the habitat for these pests, because they don't want the open sight lines. They want to be able to hide from these predators. And step five, we can't do it all ourselves. Know how and when to seek professional help. This is a pretty subjective step. It depends on how serious your problem is. You're frustrated that every year your sugar snap peas in the spring get eaten by rabbits, and these are the smartest rabbits on earth, and they've gotten through all the cages and the fences that you've put up, and there's nothing you can do. Sure, why don't you call a professional? Maybe you'll find out that it's not rabbits actually at all, and it's neighbor kids stealing your peas. Doing the 4 steps before this 5th step to help inform the professionals, that's going to make the process easier. Understanding a positive identification of what the pest is and what type of hazard it's posing. Is it a nuisance, or are we talking a health hazard? Is there a pest that maybe you see signs of rabies on a wild pest? That's going to be important information that you want to provide to a professional, should you choose to seek them for help. Those are kind of like the core 5 principles to identifying and managing a problem. But one other tenet of handling pests in your environment is understanding the laws and regulations that manage vertebrates pest control. So when we're talking vertebrates, it's any animal that has a backbone or a spinal column. So it's mammals, it's birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish. all vertebrate pests are governed through the laws that you're seeing on your screen right now, at least for Virginia. It's a combination of the Code of Virginia's laws, the Virginia Administrative Code, which is actually something else. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources is kind of a third category of Virginia-based law. And then you have a federal-based law, which is the Code of Federal Regulations. And then to take it even further, sometimes you'll have local ordinances, maybe county or neighborhood ordinances that you need to follow for pest management. These laws, they identify which pests you can control in which ways and why. For example, a non-native pest, and we're going to get into this here shortly, but a non-native pest, maybe they're going to just kind of open the floodgates and let any person who's identified that as a problem, they can just handle it without any additional permits, requests, or maybe an effective control for a particular pest is to remove it, eliminate it yourself. If you're living in the country, you use a firearm maybe, but if you're not living in a country, let's say you're living in Arlington or Fairfax or Alexandria, according to your local ordinances, where you're not going to be in your backyard pulling out, the shotgun for the groundhog. That's not going to work in our area. So understanding the core state and the more strategic laws that categorize the pests, and then zeroing into your local laws is going to be critical to understanding what you're able to do yourself. Nuisance species are one of the categories, or it's a code really, that the Virginia Administrative Code and the Code of Federal Regulations assigns to certain animals. These animals meet the definition of being nuisance species because they're usually a combination of being non-native or some type of exotic, and they're invasive at the same time, or there's a problem with them being in our environment. Nuisance species aren't protected under the laws, the previously mentioned laws. Animals that meet these conditions can be taken, is the term, at any time. There's a stipulation that it needs to be conducted lawfully. So we really don't like feral hogs. They're a nuisance in Virginia, but I mean, they're still a living animal that needs to be treated with respect, and controlling that pest needs to be conducted in a lawful manner. Plus, there's also other subcategories, not necessarily nuisance species, but species when they're causing damage or doing flocking a certain way, or threatening livestock, or creating a different hazard, like a health of human hazard. When that activity is taking place, then they kind of fall into the category of nuisance species, and you have a little bit more flexibility as far as the code goes to control that particular species. Here's kind of a breakdown of the classification. There's nuisance birds, mammals, and then nuisance under certain conditions, which is what I was just alluding to. This isn't a comprehensive list. The list is updated every year. This is most of the nuisance species listed out. But you can see like a series of birds, like the house sparrow is very common. The European starling is all over this area. Nuisance mammals, you might not even realize that they're nuisances or would be classified as a nuisance because they're so they're so normalized, like a groundhog, being a nuisance. You might not have guessed that. And then under certain conditions, again, that's usually when there's some other type of hazard. In the case of these birds, birds tend to be classified as nuisance either when they're especially prone to carrying disease, or when they gather and flock to a point that it's either a noise issue, or they flock in such numbers that there's excessive dropping because of the particular bird's habits. Exceptions to nuisance, permits and trapping and shooting animals. This is kind of a very high level, just a few of the key, most likely exceptions here that are listed in the laws. So game animals like bear and deer, outside of their established seasons, when they're conducting certain activity, they're listed as not necessarily as a nuisance, but they're part of the exception. Regularly performing trapping or shooting of these animals, at least for the case of bear and deer, you would have an established season. There's a permit that you have to get. There's a limit to the amount of tags that you can get. And that's all part of the sustainability of the landscape and the environment and those animals. But when it comes to something like raccoons and muskrats, in areas without continuous open trapping season, which is, if you look at the Northern Virginia area, it's mostly a continuous open trapping season. Then you would, in that case, need a special permit to trap or shoot. Snakes, it's technically illegal to kill any snake in Virginia, unless the snake poses an imminent health or safety threat. So that's kind of an example, a good example of the exception. If you think about functionally what this law does, when have you crossed paths with a snake and you don't feel you're in an imminent health or safety threat? I don't think that's very often. At least personally, I wouldn't feel that way. But functionally, this is probably to stop any type of systematic targeting of species of snake. So it's creating there's like a sub bullet here that's like, it has to be a problem for you to take any action against it. So outside of that environment, then it would be illegal. And then non-game animals like bats, as I mentioned before, they can be taken without a permit if they pose a health hazard or they're a nuisance. So that's up to interpretation by the legal types. If there's bats that are dive bombing you in your yard, or maybe biting or running into you, then I would argue that would be a nuisance, and that would probably fall under that stipulation. And nuisance wildlife trapping requires a commercial nuisance animal permit. This allows wildlife managers to transport and trap outside the trapping season without a permit. So it's just part of maintaining accountability for the local area. So onto the 5 steps of pest management decision making. The pest management guide that the Virginia Cooperative Extension publishes every year, these are kind of their 5 steps for the decision making process. And it's very similar to what we talked about previously: identifying and assessing the problem. And you want to determine if the offending species conflict warrants some type of applied control. It's very simple. Evaluate the potential methods. Once you've identified what the species is, like, what options are available to you? What controls work against that particular pest? Discovering the permissions, just as the legal side. Maybe you are legally bound from conducting any type of control against whatever pest you've identified. So you just need to call the professionals who likely already have the permits set up and the expertise. And then implementing one or more control methods, selecting and carrying out the most suitable method as long as you have the permits, and then employing those methods in a systematic way so that you can conduct step 5, which is monitor your results. So determine if your treatment is effective or ineffective. So that's kind of the core methodology. Those are the core ideas behind pest management. So I'm going to take some questions, and then coming up next, just for your awareness, is going to be we're going to have a kind of a list of very common pests for our local area, and we're going to talk about controls for those different pests.
Jason, I think we have answered most of the questions in the chat box, but we have a wide array of animal pests that have been mentioned in the chat box, including mice, voles, chipmunk, rabbits, deer, rats, groundhogs, squirrels, and so on. The one question I think that I would love to, I think you'd like to answer would be the question from somebody who said, we get told in other presentations to leave wood piles and other debris for wildlife to live in. Here we have a wildlife pest situation, and we're being told to remove things like that. Do you have any guidance for that?
Yeah, I think it's a case-by-case basis. The idea is to kind of coexist with nature in its normal state as much as you can, right? Without changing as much as you can. What's the saying, Kirsten? I always forget it. It's whenever you're talking about planting vegetables, it's like some go to you, some go to nature. How does that go again? One for the groundhog, one for the squirrel, one for the disease organisms, one for the insects, one for you. Yeah, that's it. Something like that. It's a truism that there's going to be, pests around, and at the same time, there's going to be non-pests that would take advantage of something like a wood pile. So as far as conflicting guidance, we're talking about controlling pests now. If your issue is pests, remove the wood pile. If you don't have a pest and that wood pile is still hanging out in your backyard, keep the wood pile. If there's probably chipmunks and squirrels living in it, and if they're not a bother to you, then kind of let them be. One comment that came in about the fact that one of the major controls for preventing wildlife pests in your landscape is to
remove the food sources. Of course, there are many lists of plants, for example, that are said to be deer-proof, and I think it's important to note when you're looking at those lists that not all those plants are native, and not all of them are safe to use in terms of being invasive or not. So really, those lists should be some plants that some deer don't eat some of the time.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's actually coming up in just a slide or two here. So I'll talk a little bit more to that as well. So we're gonna start going through some slides on the pests that I had listed on the very first slide. So we're going to talk rabbit and deer, and then we'll go into some of the other common pests that I heard you all talking about in the chat box. And we're going to kind of break them down, how the pest management guide breaks them down. We're going to look at the cultural controls, mechanical controls, and chemical controls for each of these pests, and then we're going to kind of try and categorize them together. So here we have rabbit and deer together. For cultural controls, selective planting and early harvesting. There's no perfect way to execute selective planting and early harvesting controls. Also, it's not a perfect science. As Kirsten was just saying, there are plants that are identified as deer-proof or rabbit-proof, rabbit deterrents. For example, onions. Rabbits don't like onions. They don't like a lot of common herbs that are grown like basil or rosemary, but I can tell you right now that a determined rabbit has no problem going around an onion to find the food that it really wants. I can tell you that one for a fact. So when it comes to cultural controls and selective planting, it has been proven effective, but it's not 100% effective. Most of these controls won't be 100% effective. There's a few exceptions. But especially the planting, mixing plants, like it helps, but it doesn't solve your problem, which is why we advocate a combined strategy approach. Mechanical controls for rabbits and deer: fences. Trapping and shooting, legal harvest, again following your local ordinance, and then your statewide ordinance for hunting seasons. And for fencing for rabbits, it seems like a lot. You want to have your garden just in your yard, and you don't want it to be a pain to access. You want it to look nice, right? A big cage over your garden doesn't necessarily look nice, but the reality is if you have a rabbit problem and they're eating all your seedlings, you're going to have to do something to help that along, if you've determined that it's important to you to have seedlings in the first place. And then for deer, similar situation. Obviously a cage type of fence would work as a mechanical control, but I think the real talking point here for deer is fences, and then we'll talk about fences a little bit more for deer in a slide or two. And then for chemical control and repellents, there are absolutely chemical controls that work for deer and rabbits, but again, there's caveats that go with each of those and the different types of chemical control repellents that you could use. So for rabbits, this is actually back to step one, identifying the right pest. Sometimes it's confused with deer or even squirrel damage. I have a picture on the next slide that kind of shows a little bit of the difference between the types of damage. Rabbits have, pointed, sharp front teeth. And when they bite, they leave a particular bite mark that it's a slanted down, like a point, like they're, just snipping through it. Like if we were to use our front teeth to bite off a stem. So identifying the particular pest being a rabbit, you're looking for that particular type of bite mark. Also, rabbits love flower stems, fruit and vegetables. Rabbits and deer tend to go for the same or very similar foods. On the topic of repellents, if you do want to go the route of a chemical control, alternating repellents and applying them regularly, alternating so that they don't get used to them, and applying regularly, because repellent, one of the caveats for repellent is it doesn't last forever. If it rains, sometimes that there needs to be a reapplication of that repellent. So here's a couple of photos showing the difference between rabbits and deer if you're trying to identify what type of pest you have. So if you think about how deer chew and their teeth, like deer kind of use their back teeth a lot, or they'll tear with their front and then chew with their back. If you look at a deer graze, they'll take a bite and then they'll kind of pull away, right? They'll pull their head to the side to remove the food that they're eating. A rabbit is a little bit more precise in the way that it bites. It has those sharp front jaws with the pointed teeth. Like it's snipping rather than grinding and pulling, and that's really how you can see the difference. Also, like in the case of this picture on the bottom right, that's a poor hosta bush that's really gone through the ringer, the size of a hosta bush, like if the tops of it are bitten off, a rabbit is not, standing up on a ladder to go up and bite the tops of your hosta off. That's definitely going to be a deer. Fences and deer. A lot of you probably know that deer are jumpers. Just putting up a fence doesn't always stop them. Deer can jump up to 8 feet high. And if they're jumping at a running start or at full speed, like they can cover almost 30 feet in some instances. Now, deer are wild animals. They're not Olympic runners and jumpers. So, they're not jumping 8 feet every time they jump, but they can do that. They've been recorded to do that. When you're considering a mechanical control for deer, you're considering fences, you have to know two things. One, they can go that high if necessary. And the other thing is that they only try to jump fences when they feel comfortable, similar to a horse. If a horse is going to step a stump for a show or hop a stump for a show, they're only going to do it if they feel comfortable that they can do that. So what you could do with deer, instead of putting up an 8-foot tall fence everywhere that you're concerned the deer are going to enter, this 45-degree angle that you can see on the bottom right photo, that is an effective tool to kind of create an illusion for the deer. They kind of see that slant. They're not sure how to judge how high that fence is. And that's kind of a secondary deterrence. So exclusion sometimes works, and plant selection also sometimes works. As I mentioned before, you can search in the pest management guide and just around the internet or other reliable resources at other extensions or our extension. These lists exist because there's been data that's proved that they work, but they're not 100% effective. You could cover your desirable plant in a ring of nasturtium and marigold 3 layers deep, but you might come out into your yard in the middle of the night and see your local rabbit in the middle of the ring chowing down. It's not a science when it comes to plant exclusion and plant selection. So on repellents, this is a list of popular deer repellents. There's a fact sheet that was created by the Cornell Cooperative Extension. These are common brand names. You may recognize some of them on the side: Deer Away, Deer Off Repellent, Tree Guard. But what's important to know when you're looking at repellents is that they all have specified and varied uses. You may have an odor repellent or a taste repellent or combination repellent. And each of those means something else for you as a gardener. If you're protecting hostas, then it's not as important. But if you're trying to, repel deer from your edible foods, your garden, your vegetable garden, you don't want to put a taste repellent on, because a taste repellent actually has to physically touch the vegetable, and you can't eat vegetables that you're spraying, deer repellent on after that. I can't imagine that it would taste very good, but I'm more concerned about the health side of that. And then for odor-based, they wear off faster. The applications tend to wash off in the rain, and then the odors they just run out of steam, they run out of power. So you have to be aware of which type of repellent you're considering, which type of chemical you're considering, and then also different chemicals formulated for different plants that they're trying to protect. So like Knott's Chew Knot on the bottom there, it's a fungicide that acts as a taste repellent, and it's for dormant trees and shrubs, right? You wouldn't want to put that on most anything but a dormant tree or shrub, I would imagine. So just if you're in the market for repellent specifically for deer, make sure that you're reading the fine print on the labels. And if you're interested in any of these, take a look at the Cornell fact sheet that I'm sure we'll share in the chat box if we haven't already. Okay, so a word from the Arlington Master Naturalists. Humans have been hunting, for centuries in our local counties, Fairfax and Montgomery. In the 90s, they began their hunting programs to help quell some of the rising deer population. And then the National Park Service started its program in 2012. And it's the data from these programs simply states that hunting is one of the most effective controls for population control when it comes to white-tailed deer. And, supporting these programs, however you may do that, that would be beneficial for the population in your area. Obviously, it's going to have less of a direct impact on your concerns in your garden or your concerns in your area. It's more of a strategic control against the deer population. Also, a fun fact, all of these programs donate any venison that they have extra to food banks. Okay, moving on to groundhogs. So looking at 3 types of control again, for groundhogs, as much as you can, exclusion, and then, mechanical controls, repellents and traps are listed as controls. However, repellents for these animals, they're registered, but they've been shown to be ineffective. They're not entirely ineffective, but there's data that show that they're not as effective as, like a deer or a rabbit repellent. Groundhogs are identified via the Virginia laws as a nuisance species. One of the tough things with groundhogs is identifying that that's your pest in question that's damaging your garden. Probably the best way, I would say, for a groundhog is to look for its entrance holes. That has a number of entrance holes, between 2 and 5 for any individual groundhog's regular activity, and they're kind of big, 10 to 12 inches. So that's a 10 to 12 inch opening with like a 8-inch diameter. So it's a big hole. They're pretty easy to identify. And exclusion, when you identify that you have a groundhog, if you're going the route of exclusion, you could create a barrier. Groundhogs kind of area that they operate in could be your yard. It could be your yard and your 2 closest neighbors' yard. That they could have a big space. So if you could identify a particular patch of your land that you wanted to protect, an 18-inch deep buried exclusion barrier could be effective. But depending on the problem set or the amount of land that you wanted protected from groundhogs, it may not be an effective solution. Raccoons, skunks, and possums all put into the same category for the same reason. They're scavengers. Kirsten mentioned earlier getting rid of access to food. So not just whatever you're growing, but whatever you're throwing away. Trash cans, food that's maybe fallen out of trash cans, or rotten vegetables on the ground. That's going to draw these types of pests. For controls, like number 1 is getting rid of all that extra food. And if you find any burrows, plugging those burrows, filling those in. For mechanical controls, trapping for skunks and possums, obviously make sure that you're following your local regulations. And I don't have to tell you, don't get too close to the skunk whenever you identify he's in your cage. So it's not listed under the skunks and the possums that frightening devices could work, but these are pretty skittish creatures. They're scavengers. They hide, and they're in and out very quick. Those are effective mechanical controls as well for those pests. And then same thing for chemical control, and this often becomes a theme beyond rabbits and deer. Repellents exist, but they're not entirely effective. Okay, moles and voles. I alluded to it earlier, the differences in moles and voles activities. Voles are looking for vegetables. Moles are looking for, well, it says on here killing white grubs, but they're not just looking for grubs. That's actually a common misconception, that moles only go where grubs go. They actually feed on earthworms as their number 1 food. And for those of us who are responsible gardeners who like to cultivate healthy soil, we're going to hopefully have earthworms and night crawlers, and that's what we want. There's no environment where we have healthy soil where we don't have those. So the presence of moles does not necessarily indicate a problem in your soil or in your garden. It just is what it is sometimes when it comes to moles and voles. Fencing and trapping, sure, you could do that, but this is when it comes to this pest, it's worth saying this is an example of, it's an uphill battle whenever you're battling moles and voles, especially when you're not giving way to the professionals on this one. It's not that your efforts aren't worth your time, but you may expect to completely eliminate the problem, and that doesn't often happen in the case of moles and voles. So I have some mole and vole specific control ideas. So short mowing for both is actually fairly effective, more effective for voles because that helps the predator sightlines. Their trails, they run those tunnels along the tops of grass, and if the grass is low, that makes it really easy for the flying predators to see them from up high. You can see for moles and voles, pet patrols are listed. That's really your local dogs. Let them, if you have a dog and you let your dog out free roam your yard, let them out. Moles and voles hate dogs to the point where they'll stop approaching an area if they feel that there's a predator that regularly patrols that area. The actual holes themselves is a separate control idea, like squashing the mounds and rolling out the mounts. If you leave them there, they're going to continue to use them. But if you fill them in, it's discouraging, especially if they're digging tunnels, a series of tunnels. It takes a lot out of them to do that. Most of the time, all they're doing is looking for food. So if you're disrupting that pattern for them, then they may determine that it's not worth their time being here anymore because they're tired of you stomping on their house. Okay, a word on what doesn't work. Moles and voles especially, there's a lot of home theory crafting on how to solve these problems. So I've highlighted a few here that you may have heard, you may have not heard. This isn't happening everywhere. It's just happened before, and we wanted to make sure that we included it so that we don't want anybody walking away from this thinking they're going to try the broken glass method where they don't want to walk on broken glass. So don't do any of that. No razor blades, no thorny. Don't poke them. Don't do anything that could be perceived as inhumane. We don't want to make the moles and voles cut their feet and then still not leave the area and just be frustrated they have cut feet. It's frightening devices when it comes to moles and voles. Actually, there's a lot of marketing for these, but they're not as effective as the marketing would lead you to believe. Same thing that I've been saying the whole presentation, plants acting as repellents. There are some plants that deter moles and voles, but it's not an exact science, and it's not going to be a solution to 100% solution to a problem. And along with the frightening devices, the electrical devices that vibrate the soil, these are tricks, and particularly with moles and voles, they're used to vibrations in the ground anyways all the time. They do work, especially when you first use them, and then over time, the ground, they'll get used to the vibrations in that area, and they'll no longer sense it as out of the ordinary. And once it's there, you might as well remove it because it's not going to do anything for you. Okay, squirrels. Squirrels is a tough one too. I think probably most people who are concerned about pests understand how resilient squirrels can be. Really, the best thing that you can do for squirrels is to trim back limbs of trees 6 to 8 feet away from any buildings. They're living in trees, they're living in cubby holes, they're living in gutters. Removing the access to those high hide places, which they usually access via tree limbs, should help with squirrels. But again, I mean, squirrels are extremely resilient. Trapping and shooting is not as effective. They breed pretty regularly. Removing bird feeders from trees is also recommended. However, I mean, I've seen squirrels do the equivalent of a double backflip to get onto my bird feeder to get one seed. So they're pretty resilient. Ideas for squirrels in the garden, that's a little different. There you have some options here. They're really looking for the fruit. If you harvest a little early, pick prior to ripening is especially effective if they're taking cherry tomatoes or berries. Caging and netting is great. And then if you don't want to get as involved, improving the line of sight for predators helps as well. And then providing, actually, this is a good one, providing alternate food and water sources. If you create a different location away from your vegetable garden in your area that, maybe it's your bird feeders and you have a bird fountain. This doesn't happen all the time, but in certain environments with squirrels, they'll go back to the same place that they got food from. And if you feed them regularly, if you bird seed, you feed birds and squirrels together indiscriminately, they'll keep coming back, and that they'll only go there for food and drink. There's a chance that they could completely avoid your garden altogether. So that's something that's worth trying. The patrol animals, that's your dogs, your pets, whatever dog type pet that you have that likes to go outside and was a predator in its in its past life and is now just a soft and cuddly with teeth. They don't like those either. Okay, so moving into birds a little, crow and European starling control. This is tough. Usually bird controls are not the type of thing that an individual or a home gardener can really do much about. I mean, there's a few exceptions, onesies and twosies, but with the birds operating area their regular travel patterns so far. Let's say you're trapping 10 European starlings. Who's to say where they actually live or where they came from? Identifying, a nest or something locally in your immediate area would be helpful, but realistically, when it comes to these birds, there's not a lot that you're going to be able to do as far as exclusion. What you want to do is remove the reason that they're there, kind of similar to the squirrels, which is, sanitation and not just removing their access to the foods that they want to get, the berries and the nuts. The starling is classified as a nuisance pest. It's a pretty looking bird, but starting back in the late 1800s, a group of about 100 were released in New York. And since then, the population has exploded. And the problem with an invasive bird is that they're aggressive. They're overabundant flocks. They fly thick. There's many. With that comes a lot of excessive droppings, and they're talkers. They will sit in the trees and yell at you all day long. It's a very invasive species. They have an attitude problem. Canadian geese. So this is a unique one. This one's tough because this is a migratory bird coming down from Canada. And there's a decent amount of rules because they're not invasive, but they are not native to this area. They're only here for a short amount of time. The controls are focused on destroying their nests and their eggs. There's kind of a special rule. Fish and Wildlife Service says that you don't need a permit to destroy nests and eggs. However, they do request that you let them know that you're doing that. So, you're not requesting a permit, you're not filing a permit. You're just saying, hey, look, I'm doing this in my property, in my area for the Canadian geese. And it's just for their tracking purposes. Mechanically, there's a season for legal harvest, but that does require a permit. Some other ideas for controlling Canadian geese. I'm not recommending any of these. They're all about the same effectiveness, but you're using different mechanical controls that are based on how the Canadian geese function as a bird, right? They like to fly low, coast above water, and then land in water. So one of the recommendations is using a fencing or a monofilament line or a fishing line. And really what you're doing is you're creating a disruption in their flight patterns, in their coast patterns, so that they don't want to fly there anymore. If they're trying to take off and they feel that they're brushing against fishing line, they're not going to want to come back to that spot. 20 to 30-inch tall brush barriers around water bodies. That's more specific if you have maybe a pond or a lake, and they tend to walk up out of that lake, and there's a lot of droppings, as you can see in the picture, that's in your area that you like to walk around and be in your yard. Creating barriers around the water is actually surprisingly effective because they land and take off from water often. So if they're landing in the water and they feel that they can't walk through your bush line, they're not going to walk through your bush line. It's as simple as that. Some other ideas for bird control in the garden. A lot of these controls are focused on a reflecting or a distracting, like bright light type of deterrence. So mylar balloons or the tape streamers or scarecrows, they're all just trying to scare birds into being uncomfortable and flying off. Also, yeah, same thing with light motion detectors. And then again, providing alternate food sources. If they land in your yard and they're drinking water and eating seed, they're not eating your vegetables. It's as simple as that. Okay, moving on to snakes. So I have here a list of snakes for Virginia, not just Arlington, Alexandria. These are Virginia snakes. There are a number of venomous snakes in Virginia. I'll have a couple of them listed here today. I'm not really concerned about talking about how venomous they are and how dangerous they are. I mean, I'll touch on it, but the core idea is that, we have snakes here. Some of them are dangerous. And, should you identify them as a pest, we can talk about control for those pests. Number one is going to be cultural control, finding and destroying their hiding places. This is really big on the rock and brush pile. If you have a snake problem, they're hiding somewhere. If you have, a cut clean landscape with no brush, it's not likely that you have a snake problem. Or maybe it'll make it easier, at least for you to identify where they are hiding. So trapping, for mechanical control, trapping and shooting. Also some fencing works. There's some details on how to make a snake fence there. That includes like galvanized cloth and keeping vegetation away from the fence. Chemical controls, there are registered chemical controls. Looking at, locations of some of the more dangerous snakes. This data is from a couple years ago, but this is the known or likely locations with a few observations of rattlesnakes and the timber rattlesnake and the canebrake rattlesnake. So Western Virginia and then Southeastern Virginia for those. And then here I have just a quick slide on the northern cottonmouth. Again, another venomous, dangerous snake. Data is a little more recent data. Again, Southeast Virginia. Let's talk about emerging pests. These nutrias, which I think look like capybaras. I always think of capybara when I see those. And wild hogs. Well, nutrias live in groups and they graze in marshes. They're kind of like beavers, but they eat above ground vegetation, and then they also dig into the ground or into the mud, and they'll uproot organic matter. So they'll tear the roots out. So they'll dig into your soil and they'll pull everything out from outside of the dirt, which is, you know, catastrophic to a plant that you care about. It's actually a problem in the wetlands because it's causing them to erode more. They're pulling out regularly, pulling out key plants that are critical to that environment, and it's becoming a problem. Also, feral hogs. We have feral hogs in Virginia, not all across Virginia just yet, but it's continuing to spread. It's continuing to grow. Feral hogs. You would think that, you know, similar to deer, hunting would be effective, but it's actually quite the opposite. Part of the reason why this species is a problem is because there's a community of hunters that enjoy hunting them. Like you're allowed to hunt things that there's a lot of. As they spread and they become more populated, there will be more opportunity to hunt. And it sounds a little odd, but there's a lot of reporting of unexplained population booms for these feral hogs in different counties where there's been no sightings previously. And it's largely suspected that there's been human intervention of some sort. What's an informed, concerned person to do when we're talking about, you know, the habitats, and how can we continue to integrate with nature while deterring pests from ruining our time in the garden? Education is number one. Classes like this, the Audubon at Home Wildlife Sanctuary has a ton of information about habitat gardening in Virginia. Their mission is really to help people understand how we can coexist, and also warn of things like the dangers of bad disease like rabies, or use of inhumane methods for controlling wildlife. And I'll show you some pictures here of sticky traps in a moment. So for rabies, make sure you vaccinate your pets. And then there's symptoms really to what to look out for whenever you're dealing with pests in your yard, so that you can appropriately identify that and then recognize that it's more of a danger than a typical pest that you're dealing with. And it would be a perfect time to call in the professionals. So again, what's an informed person to do? Never recommend or attempt to control before making a positive idea of what you're trying to control, especially for the last few things we mentioned: snakes, diseased animals. Make sure you know what it is. If you're not sure what it is, just call in a professional. Of course, if there's any human life in danger, call 911, and then take preventive precautions to prevent damage to non-target animal and insects. That's actually a point that I didn't hit on earlier. The whole point of approaching the problem the way that we're approaching the problem is to minimize the impact on other species, not just the environment, but other species in the environment. You know, we could bomb our yards with a chemical that would get rid of moles and voles, but it would probably also harm the bee population, chipmunks, rabbits, bugs, pollinators, and we don't want to do that. That's not what we're trying to do. And you know, again, this is the picture that I was talking about, not using inhumane methods to control pests, right? Stick to the recommendations that I talked about today that are in the Cooperative Extension Pest Management Guide and that are sanctioned by the various levels of Virginia and federal law. Yep, and you know, look for ways to limit damage. And once you identify its underlying cause, that's how you want to choose your target. It's not always safe or legal to use popular damage management tactics. True, it might be really popular in some parts of the country to just throw those sticky traps down because they get snakes every time, but it's not legal, and it's definitely not safe. And many times a professional trapper should be hired. So if you feel you need to know more, we have resource pages. There's a number of links that were provided in the chat, a few handouts that I believe were sent out to all registered participants. You have the Extension Master Gardener Help Desk and other various cooperative extension publications, as well as partner organizations in our local Virginia area. Here is the help desk information, if it wasn't already put in the chat, with the email and the phone number. They're open weekdays, 9 to noon. That's it. So we can take questions before we close out. Kirsten.
I just wanted to remind everybody that if you want to save the chat for your own use, there's a little tab at the bottom, little square at the bottom of the chat box that has 3 dots in it. And if you click on that, you can have the option to save the chat to your own computer for later viewing. Recording of the program will be available in about a week at the mgnv.org website. The question was about tomatoes, and you addressed that a little bit related to the use of water, adding water to the landscape for birds to get water, moisture, and preventing that kind of damage. But there are other things that also eat tomatoes, aren't there?
Yeah, there's the tomato fruit worm. Wasn't really covered in this presentation, but yeah, there's bugs and insects that would cause that type of damage. Birds come down often and they'll peck through tomatoes. They'll have like little beak-sized holes sometimes, but if it's a perfect small circle hole, it's more than likely not a bird because they're not just one quick in and out. They're kind of like a little pecking, for a while until they get a little chunk off.
Yeah, I think that you could also get holes in tomatoes from hornworms that will directly feed on the tomatoes. And those are pretty easy to see. And if you have access to a black light, go out at nighttime and look for hornworms on your tomatoes because they can destroy a tomato crop and your tomato plant very quickly. Squirrels will sometimes feed, and groundhogs, of course, certainly will love your tomatoes if you have access to them. The other question was about dismantling rebuilding a stone wall. Do you have any advice for somebody who wants to rebuild a stone wall but minimize the damage to the chipmunks that currently live there?
Without understanding the specifics, obviously you would want to be careful with disassembly, assuming that you can disassemble safely. Making sure that there is somewhere else for them to go would be a thing that you could do. You can't guarantee that they're going to migrate where you want them to go, or that they'll come back to a new wall or stay in your area once you disrupt their living space. But the best thing that you could do is make sure that if you have shrubs or brush piles or a little bit of overgrown property, make sure that you don't decide to clean that out right before you tear down the wall. Give them somewhere to hide. It's probably the best thing you could do.
Right, and I guess I would add that the chipmunks will survive. The chipmunks will survive, and if you do this outside of the winter sort of hibernation period and the breeding season, do it sometime in the summer, I think you'll be okay.
That's a great point. Get them while they're active. They won't even mind.
One of the things that copperheads can be identified by is the Hershey kiss type of dark design, which is wider at the base than it is at the top. We've gotten several questions this summer about a mistaken identity, northern water snakes being mistaken for copperheads. And the markings are very different.
And copperhead is one of the venomous ones, folks.
That's right.
So that's just be aware of the pattern. You don't need to be a snake identification expert, but just recognize that we do have venomous snakes in Virginia. Not a lot are listed in our northeastern area, though.
And I think we should also go back to the cottonmouth picture again, because we do get questions about coppermouth. And so far, they are only in the southern part, the southeastern part of Virginia. They're not known to be in northern Virginia yet. That's right. The copperhead has a yellow tipped tail. Thank you, Steve. Especially when they're young. The young ones do. And the young ones are more dangerous than the adult copperheads are, because the adults have learned what's food and what's not food. And the young ones have not done that quite yet. And they are less likely to be able to control the amount of venom that they release into a bite. All right, well, thank you very, very much. There was a really good advice here from somebody who said that last year, a rabid raccoon was dealt with by the Animal Welfare League of Alexandria. And these professionals are very, very skilled and trained to deal with problem wildlife. And I don't think you should ever, would ever regret calling either the Wildlife League of Arlington or of Alexandria and seeking professional help for this. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Leslie, for your help today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend.